What happens if you lose everything? You go bankrupt. It's a question which may face more of us if interest rates rise. But what happens when discharging the debt can cost you many times over? Sometimes debtors have no choice but to allow professionals called insolvency practitioners to manage their affairs. And the government is increasingly concerned that the fees they charge can be very high. Even over a small debt of just several £1,000s, fees can bring the total bill to tens of thousands. The consequences can be devastating, as Richard Watson has been finding out in a report made with Firecrest Films.
Debtor, bankrupt, terms which instill fear and shame. And for friends and family, the stakes can be very high. When people can't pay, professionals are brought in to handle their assets, but they charge fees, often by the hour. The government is reviewing the level of fees across the insolvency business. We've also been investigating fees charged by lawyers and accountants when things go wrong, and some of what we found gives rise to serious cause for concern. Alan Town, who's 55, used to live in his own home. After being made bankrupt, he's moved back in with his 92-year-old father.
I'm very lucky that I've had the support of my family. A lot of people, however, do not have that sort of support. So if their properties are lost, they'd be out on the streets.
Alan used to live in a flat he owned outright here in southeast London. It was forcibly sold after he was made bankrupt over unpaid council tax of £7,000. Other debts brought the total amount owed to £27,000. In bankruptcy, the costs began to rise steeply. £13,000 of fees were payable to the government, called Secretary of State fees, and £11,000 were legal fees. But the single biggest cost came from fees charged by what's known as a trustee in bankruptcy, appointed to sell assets so creditors can be paid. £36,000 were from Alan's trustee, who worked for a big firm of accountants. The total cost of bankruptcy, including his initial debts, came to just under £100,000. His flat was sold to pay the bill.
Well, basically, here
the trustee told the family that the reason costs were so high was because Alan was obstructive and didn't engage in the process. In Alan Town's case, his trustee in bankruptcy was from a company now owned by accountancy giant Baker Tilly. We asked them to explain the fees, which will run up over nearly 3 years, but they told us, "We do not consider it is appropriate to comment on individual cases." So what are trustees' fees? They're usually charged in bankruptcies by insolvency practitioners. Their job is to realise assets of the bankrupt to pay creditors what they're owed. Critics argue the way they're currently paid, often by the hour, can send bills sky high.
There are very, very high charge-out rates. Even ordinary labour gets charged out at 3 figures plus. So it is very, very lucrative. It is virtually a license to print money.
The minister responsible for insolvency has been consulting with the industry.
We are certainly concerned in government about the level of fees. We've just closed a consultation looking at how we can change the way that fees are charged. We're looking at flat rate fees and looking at fees as a proportion of the assets that are recovered and so on. So we're looking at a variety of different options.
So they seem to be a But the insolvency industry opposes the idea of fixed fees.
The fixed fee idea has been put forward by government in its recent consultation. We actually don't think that that is the right way to go, and the reason that we don't think that that is the case is we don't think that there's any evidence to show that that will work.
The report which lies behind the government's plans for reform raises particular concern about small personal bankruptcies where there's a family home at stake. Often fees rise massively when people fight to avoid paying debts. For 30 years, Peter Williams lived and worked in his house in Bedfordshire. But astonishingly, a £1,350 debt he owed to his council spiralled into an £80,000 bill. His family says it cost Peter his home and his life.
I was totally appalled. absolutely appalled and could not believe it. A debt of £1,350, and to actually pursue it in this way, to make somebody bankrupt, is beyond belief.
Colleagues say Peter Williams was a brilliant inventor, but his private life started falling apart after he fell ill in the 1990s. Friends and family say he was vulnerable. Council tax bills went unpaid for almost 10 years. The council says he had plenty of chances to settle. Eventually, he was made bankrupt. He paid some council tax, but with legal fees, he still owed around £1,350. The accountancy firm Grant Thornton was appointed as Peter's trustee in bankruptcy, and that meant they handled his assets, like his house here, to make sure his debts were paid. The fees for Peter Williams' bankruptcy began to climb. In 2010, his friend asked the council for a breakdown of the bill.
They wrote back to us and told us that we will not tell you how the debt is broken down, because if we calculate how it is broken down, it will further inflate the debt.
As in most insolvencies, Grant Thornton was charging by the hour. A partner is charged out at £450 an hour. An administrator, it's more than £150 an hour. Even for assistants and support staff, it's over £140 an hour. Soon the bill was in the tens of thousands. Peter Williams's house was to be sold to pay this and other bills. Finally, a date in February 2012 was set for Peter's eviction. On that day, a policeman called at his sister's house.
He told me that my brother had died. And I just couldn't believe it, because I didn't know anything about what had been going on. And I just could not believe it.
Peter Williams had taken his own life. After his death, his family is told the costs of his bankruptcy, nearly £80,000. More than £27,000 were fees charged by Grant Thornton as trustee.
I was horrified, absolutely horrified. The minute trustees in bankruptcy are brought in, there is a huge charge.
Grant Thornton told Newsnight that Mr. Williams' family have their deepest sympathies. They said the progression of the bankruptcy required numerous court hearings, all of which necessarily contributed to the time and costs involved. They also said they agreed to repeated deferrals of the possession order to allow Mr. Williams further time to explore his available options. But was it right to force him into bankruptcy for such a small debt in the first place? Currently, those who owe just £750 can be subject to bankruptcy law.
The level of £750 was set in 1986, and clearly times have changed, and what was appropriate then is very different now. That's why I am looking at this to see whether the threshold does need to be increased.
Central Bedfordshire Council told us they've always recognised the tragic nature of Peter Williams' death, but that for more than a decade he didn't pay the council tax he was charged. The council distanced itself from the eviction, saying the debt that ultimately led to action to repossess Mr. Williams' home related to the costs pursued by Grant Thornton, which were entirely outside of the council's control. The insolvency profession currently has 8 regulators who people can complain to if they feel they've been treated unfairly, but they cannot assess the level of fees charged by trustees.
You're put in a position where you have to accept what they've said and what they're willing to give you at the end of the process.
And the regulator won't look at it?
Yeah, well, I don't know what the regulator, I don't know what the regulator actually does.
Insolvency cases are driven by law, and therefore at the moment the redress for someone who has got concerns about insolvency practitioner fees is to go to the court.
Well, obviously now, someone who's facing that level of debt is not going to go to the court to get them assessed, is it? Because it's a vastly expensive process.
Well, the court is actually is very ready to look at insolvency practitioners' fees.
The government wants to reform the bankruptcy business by strengthening regulation and capping fees. The insolvency industry is resisting some of the changes, but for families affected, reform is long overdue.